Dean Martin refused a mafia boss's offer. His reason will make you respect him forever. The gun wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It sat on the table, inches from the spotlight, owned by a man who owned the room, without standing up. Dean Martin saw it mid-song, felt the danger instantly, and understood the message. What he did next shocked everyone. Where are you watching from tonight? Las Vegas in the mid-1960s wasn't built on neon and smiles alone. It ran on fear, favors, and quiet understandings. The casinos glittered, but behind the curtains, men with soft voices made hard decisions. Everyone working the strip knew the rule. You didn't embarrass the wrong people. Singers, dealers, managers. Talent didn't protect you. Obedience did. Dean Martin knew these rules better than most. He wasn't naive, and he wasn't reckless. He'd spent years watching who shook whose hand, who never waited in line, who always got silence when they entered a room. On that night at the Sands, the stakes weren't about money or ego. They were about survival and reputation in a city where both could vanish quietly. The audience came to relax, drink, laugh. They didn't see the invisible wires pulling everything together. But Dean did. He felt them tighten as soon as he noticed the man in the front row, surrounded by stillness, with eyes that didn't blink for applause. This wasn't a fan. This was an owner without paperwork. The band played on, but something fundamental had shifted. In Vegas, moments like this decided who you were allowed to be tomorrow. Power in that era wasn't loud. It was subtle, almost polite. A nod could mean opportunity. A pause could mean danger. When powerful men attended shows, performers adjusted instinctively. Shorter jokes, safer lyrics, gratitude expressed just enough. Everyone understood that humiliation was unforgivable. You could be talented, beloved, even famous, but none of that outweighed disrespect. Dean Martin's career thrived inside this reality. He was known as relaxed, effortless, a man who made charm look easy. But behind the glass of whiskey and the lazy grin was calculation. He watched rooms the way card players watched hands. That night, the atmosphere changed with surgical precision. The clinking glasses slowed. Laughter thinned. People sensed something without knowing what. The man in the front row didn't smile. He leaned back, one arm resting casually near the table, confidence bordering on boredom. The gun wasn't brandished, it was implied. That was the message. I don't need to threaten you. Dean understood immediately. This wasn't random intimidation. It was an invitation wrapped in warning. Vegas thrived on these moments, where cooperation was expected before refusal was ever spoken. And refusing, in this city, came with consequences no one advertised. This wasn't about a song choice or a joke gone wrong. It was about control. The offer would come, subtle and smooth, as they always did. A request framed as respect. An expectation disguised as generosity. In return, loyalty. Silence. Compliance. For many performers, this was simply how business worked. You accepted the protection, the backing, the unspoken shield that kept doors open and problems away. Dean had benefited from this ecosystem before, like everyone else. But tonight was different. The timing, the setting, the public nature of it, it all mattered. The Sands was packed. Cameras were present. Whispers traveled faster than sound. If Dean played this wrong, it wouldn't just affect him. It would ripple outward, to his family, his band, his future bookings. This was a test disguised as courtesy. The kind of moment that defined whether you were owned or merely tolerated. Dean felt the weight of it settle in his chest as he finished the verse. The applause came late, unsure. Somewhere behind the spotlight, decisions were already forming. In Vegas, reputation wasn't what people said about you. It was what they dared not do to you. And tonight, Dean Martin stood at the edge of a line that few crossed willingly. Dean Martin wasn't born into power. He was born Dino Crocetti, the son of Italian immigrants who understood hard work and quiet pride. His father cut hair. His mother kept order. Respect wasn't demanded in his house. It was earned through restraint. Dean learned early that dignity didn't need volume. As a teenager, he worked steel mills, dealt cards, took punches, and learned when to speak and when to stay silent. That upbringing shaped him more than fame ever could. Even as success came, records, movies, packed rooms, he carried an internal line. He wouldn't let anyone cross. He played the clown on stage, but off stage he was observant, guarded, and deeply private. He'd seen men mistake access for ownership. He'd watched others disappear from marquees after crossing the wrong people. Dean never pretended he was fearless. Courage, to him, wasn't bravado. It was choosing the cost you could live with. On that night, memories surfaced uninvited. His parents' insistence on self-respect, the shame of being controlled, the quiet humiliation that lingered longer than bruises. The offer coming his way wasn't new, but the expectation behind it was. And for the first time in a long while, Dean felt that familiar tightening in his gut, the signal that a line was about to be tested. By the mid-60s, Dean had everything most men wanted: money, fame, admiration. But what mattered more to him was autonomy. He valued the illusion of ease because it hid discipline and choice. He didn't need to dominate rooms. He needed to leave them on his own terms. Friends often mistook his calm for indifference. It wasn't. It was control. He understood that once you accepted certain favors, they never stopped being owed. A drink became a debt. A favor became a leash. The men who ran Vegas thrived on that imbalance. They didn't rush. They waited. Dean had navigated this world carefully, never insulting, never groveling. But refusing outright was rare, dangerous. Still, something in him resisted being claimed. As the band slowed, he caught the eye of the floor manager, wide-eyed, pale, silently begging for compliance. Dean looked away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He was resolved. The offer would come through an intermediary, polite and heavy with implication. All Dean had to do was nod, smile, keep singing. But nodding meant more than agreement. It meant permission. And Dean Martin had spent his life choosing when to say yes. Tonight, the cost of that choice was about to be paid in public. Dean's inner strength didn't come from ego. It came from clarity. He knew exactly who he was without the spotlight. Fame amplified character. It didn't create it. The mobsters in the room relied on fear because fear worked. But Dean believed fear also revealed weakness. He'd watched tough men crumble when dignity was stripped away. He'd watched others survive by refusing to surrender their sense of self. As he stood there, microphone warm in his hand, he felt strangely calm. Not brave, calm. The kind of calm that comes when the decision is already made. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't posturing. He simply knew that accepting this offer would follow him forever, shaping how others treated him, how he saw himself. That was the real threat. Not violence, but erosion. He glanced again at the man in front, the unspoken ruler of the room. Their eyes met briefly. No smile. No challenge. Just expectation. Dean inhaled, let the silence stretch a beat longer than comfortable. In that pause, the entire room leaned forward, sensing significance without understanding it. Vegas respected moments like this. They were rare. And when they happened, everyone remembered where they were. The first warning came quietly. A waiter lingered too long near the stage, murmuring something about a special guest who wished to be acknowledged. Dean nodded without commitment. The second warning followed minutes later. Someone from management suggesting a dedication, a gesture of appreciation. Nothing explicit, nothing threatening. But the pressure was building. People close to Dean shifted nervously. The band avoided eye contact. They'd seen careers end over less. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about signaling alignment. The man in the front row remained still, patient. Power never rushed. Dean felt the room divide subtly, those aware of the tension and those blissfully unaware. He continued the set, voice steady, timing perfect. That was the most unsettling part. He didn't flinch. The lack of reaction made people uneasy. By the third song, the warnings stopped. Silence replaced them. And silence in Vegas was louder than threats. Dean understood what that meant. The decision had been pushed back into his hands. Accept or force a confrontation no one wanted. His heart beat slower now. He wasn't stalling. He was choosing the moment. The crowd applauded, still smiling, still drinking, unaware that a quiet standoff was unfolding under the lights. Dean wiped his brow, adjusted the microphone, and prepared to step off script in a city that punished improvisation. Fear spread sideways, not forward. It moved through whispers, glances, half-steps. A woman near the bar sensed it and stopped laughing mid-sentence. A dealer in the back crossed his arms, eyes fixed on the stage. The tension wasn't explosive, it was suffocating. Dean's name carried weight, but not immunity. Everyone knew stories, men who refused, men who vanished, men who smiled too much afterward. The unspoken question hung in the air. Would he bend? The man in the front row finally leaned forward slightly. Not a command, a reminder. Dean felt it like a hand on his shoulder. He finished the song to polite applause and let the last note fade completely. No immediate joke. No banter. That alone broke protocol. Performers filled silence to maintain control. Dean let it sit. Seconds stretched. Someone coughed. He looked down at the man, then at the crowd, and then back again. This wasn't defiance yet. It was assessment. He was reading the room, gauging how far the power extended, how much of it relied on the illusion of consent. Fear existed, yes, but so did witnesses. That mattered. Public spaces changed calculations. Dean knew that if he spoke, every word would land harder because it couldn't be erased. Pressure peaked when someone finally approached the stage. A familiar face, smiling too hard, leaning in as if sharing a joke. Just a word, he said softly. Dean listened, nodded once, and pulled back. The message was clear now. A generous offer. Protection. Future favors. In return, acknowledgement. Loyalty. No refusal mentioned, because refusal wasn't considered. Dean thanked him politely. The man retreated, tension following him like a shadow. The front row figure waited. He didn't need to hear the conversation. He trusted the system. That trust was the real power. Dean felt a flicker of anger, not hot, not reckless, but sharp. Not at the man. At the assumption that his dignity had a price. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, lights washing out the crowd beyond the first rows. The band watched him carefully, unsure whether to continue. Dean raised a hand. They stopped. Silence fell completely now. This was the moment everyone feared. Public refusal wasn't just rude. It was destabilizing. It introduced unpredictability into a system built on control. Dean knew that once he spoke, there was no walking it back. But he also knew that silence would cost him more than words ever could. Dean cleared his throat. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind himself he was there. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice calm, almost warm. A ripple of relief moved through the crowd. An introduction meant safety. He smiled faintly, then looked directly at the man in the front row. No hostility. No challenge. Just acknowledgement. "I've been asked to make a dedication tonight." The room froze. This was it. Everyone waited for the bow, the gratitude, the performance of loyalty. Dean paused again. The pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he spoke. "I'm grateful to everyone who comes here to enjoy music." He gestured broadly, including the crowd. "But I don't dedicate songs under pressure." Gasps followed, soft but unmistakable. Dean continued before fear could fill the gap. "I sing for people, not power." His tone never rose. He didn't accuse. He didn't name names. That was the genius. He framed the refusal as principle, not insult. He stepped back from the microphone and waited. No music. No jokes. Just stillness. The man in the front row didn't move. Neither did anyone else. For a few heartbeats, the entire room existed inside that silence, holding its breath. The silence was heavier than any shout. Dean stood there, hands relaxed, expression neutral. He wasn't daring anyone to react. He was allowing space for choice. The crowd shifted, sensing history in the making without understanding the details. Someone clapped once, hesitant, unsure. It stopped. Dean looked out again, scanning faces, grounding himself in the ordinary humanity of the room. Couples, tourists, workers. This wasn't about hierarchy anymore. It was about presence. The front row man finally leaned back, fingers drumming once on the table. The gun stayed where it was, untouched. That mattered. Dean didn't fill the moment with bravado. He simply waited. Waiting forced the power structure to respond. Eventually, the band leader glanced at Dean, silently asking what to do. Dean nodded. The music resumed softly, cautiously. The spell broke, but the tension didn't vanish. Dean sang again, same voice, same ease. That was the point. He hadn't fled. He hadn't escalated. He'd refused and continued. In a city that equated refusal with disrespect, this was radical. The man in the front row watched without expression. Others watched him, measuring his reaction. Power hated being observed. And tonight it was. As the set continued, the atmosphere shifted from fear to awe. Not applause-driven awe, but something quieter. Dean hadn't embarrassed anyone. He hadn't exposed secrets. He'd simply asserted boundaries in public. That restraint confused people. It denied the antagonist the satisfaction of retaliation. Each song landed heavier now, every lyric charged with implication. The crowd listened differently. They weren't just entertained, they were witnesses. Dean finished the set to applause that started scattered and grew into something unified, almost defiant. He bowed slightly, not toward the front row, but toward the room. When he left the stage, backstage was chaos. Managers whispered urgently. Someone asked if he was insane. Someone else asked if he needed protection. Dean shrugged off the questions. He wasn't reckless. He was done. The real confrontation, he knew, wouldn't happen under lights. It would happen afterward, quietly, where real power preferred to operate. As he walked down the corridor, he felt the delayed tremor of adrenaline. His hands shook briefly. He steadied them. Courage didn't erase fear, it followed it. He paused at the dressing room door, inhaled, and prepared for whatever came next. The confrontation didn't come as a threat. It came as a conversation. A knock. A pause. The man entered alone, without entourage, without display. That alone was significant. Power often revealed itself in solitude. He closed the door gently. "You put me in a position," he said evenly. Dean met his gaze. "I didn't intend to," Dean replied. "I intended to be honest." There was no apology, no defiance, just truth. The man studied him, searching for fear, finding composure instead. "People don't usually say no like that," he said. Dean nodded. "I don't usually have to." The exchange was simple, almost respectful. That was the genius. Dean hadn't framed the refusal as rebellion. He framed it as identity. Something not for sale. The man exhaled slowly, considering. Public humiliation would have demanded response. Private principle required thought. "You could have handled it differently," he said. Dean agreed. "So could you." Silence again. Then, unexpectedly, the man laughed, short, surprised. Not amused. Acknowledging. "You've got nerve," he said. Dean didn't deny it. He didn't claim virtue. He just stood there, steady, letting the moment define itself. What followed wasn't forgiveness. It was recalibration. The man spoke about respect, about lines crossed and lines understood. Dean listened. He didn't argue. He didn't grovel. He made one thing clear. His performances were his own. Not leverage. Not currency. The man considered this longer than expected. Finally, he extended his hand. Not as a demand. As an acknowledgement. Dean shook it. The handshake wasn't warm, but it was real. "You embarrassed no one," the man said. "That matters." Dean nodded. He knew this wasn't friendship. It was recognition. In that world, recognition was survival. Word would spread. Not that Dean defied the mob, but that he couldn't be quietly owned. That distinction mattered. The man left without another word. Dean sat down, feeling the weight drain from his shoulders. He hadn't won. He'd held ground. Outside, the hallway buzzed with speculation. Inside, Dean felt oddly peaceful. He'd paid a price, but it was one he could afford. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. Older somehow, steadier. For the first time that night, he smiled fully. The story traveled fast, as stories do in closed systems. By morning, everyone who mattered knew. Not the details. Those were unnecessary, but the outcome. Dean Martin had refused, publicly, without insult. That nuance fascinated people. Some admired it. Some resented it. But all respected it. The power dynamic had shifted subtly. Dean wasn't untouchable. No one was. But he was no longer assumed. That changed how rooms treated him. At his next performance, the front rows looked different. More space. More distance. Less expectation. Dean noticed and said nothing. His genius reaction wasn't the refusal itself. It was the way he absorbed the aftermath, without exploiting it. He didn't tell the story. He didn't posture. He let others tell it for him. That restraint preserved its power. In Vegas, legends weren't built on volume. They were built on what people whispered when you weren't there. Dean returned to work, to singing, to being himself. But something fundamental had changed. He'd proven that dignity could exist inside a corrupt system without pretending to purify it. That was rare. And rarity, in Vegas, was currency. The antagonist's reaction echoed quietly through the city. There was no retaliation. No sudden cancellations. No closed doors. That absence spoke louder than punishment ever could. The crowd's reaction was equally telling. Audiences leaned in, sensing substance beneath the charm. Dean's performances took on new weight. Lines about independence landed differently. Silences felt intentional. Authority figures noticed too. Not with applause, but with caution. They adjusted. The tension broke not with celebration, but with acceptance. The system absorbed the anomaly and moved on, slightly altered. That was the real victory. Dean hadn't shattered anything. He'd bent it, just enough to breathe. Privately, people approached him, musicians, staff, strangers, quietly thanking him. Not for defiance, but for showing that refusal didn't have to be loud or reckless. Dean accepted none of the praise publicly. He didn't want a banner. He wanted space. And he'd earned it. The man in the front row never returned to another show. That absence was deliberate. A boundary respected. In Vegas, respect was often transactional. This time, it was principled. Dean continued on, unchanged on the surface, but anchored more firmly within. Authorities never intervened. They rarely did unless chaos demanded it. This situation resolved itself precisely because it remained contained. That containment was Dean's doing. By refusing without accusation, he denied escalation. By staying calm, he forced others to do the same. The crowd, sensing the release, relaxed back into entertainment. Life resumed. But something lingered, a shared understanding that a line had been drawn and not erased. Dean's reputation shifted subtly from entertainer to man of principle. Not outspoken, not political, just grounded. In a city that thrived on leverage, grounding was disruptive. Invitations continued. Contracts remained intact. That was the quiet confirmation. He hadn't miscalculated. The tension had broken cleanly, without shrapnel. Years later, people would misremember the event, adding drama, danger, heroics. Dean never corrected them. He knew the truth was simpler and stronger. It wasn't about bravery under fire. It was about choosing not to kneel when standing cost less than surrender. The city respected that calculus. And so did he. In private, Dean reflected on the moment with surprising softness. He spoke to close friends about fear, about the pause before speaking, about how close he'd come to choosing the easier path. He admitted the temptation. He admitted the doubt. That honesty mattered more than the story itself. One friend asked if he'd do it again. Dean thought for a long time before answering. Only if I had to, he said. He didn't romanticize the risk. He understood that survival sometimes required compromise, but he also understood that identity required limits. That night had clarified his. He slept better afterward, not because the danger was gone, but because the decision was made. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. Life continued. The absence of fallout was the reward. Dean carried the lesson quietly, applying it elsewhere, in smaller moments, where refusal mattered just as much. He never framed it as a moral victory. It was personal, and personal truths, he believed, didn't need applause. Years later, when asked indirectly about standing up to power, Dean deflected with humor. He preferred stories that made people laugh. But occasionally, when the room was right, he'd say something simple. You don't owe everyone an answer. That was as close as he came to confession. The handshake, the silence, the refusal, those details faded. What remained was the impression that Dean Martin wasn't just effortless charm. He was choice. He'd shown that dignity could be exercised without spectacle. That courage could be quiet. That genius reactions didn't require grand speeches, just timing and restraint. Younger performers heard the story and listened differently. Not because it promised safety, but because it modeled self-respect. Dean never positioned himself as a guide. He was simply an example. And examples, when authentic, outlast instructions. The truth of that night lived on not as a headline, but as a standard. Something people measured themselves against when the room grew quiet, and a decision waited. The legend of that night settled into Vegas lore, polished by retelling but anchored in truth. Dean Martin refused, not with defiance, not with fear, but with clarity. That was the lesson. Power expects reaction. It feeds on extremes. Dean denied it both. He chose principle over permission, dignity over ease. In doing so, he reminded everyone watching that respect doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from refusal delivered with calm. Years later, people still quote him, still debate the risk, still admire the restraint. Not because he challenged power, but because he defined himself. In a city built on illusions, that was real. And real things, once seen, are hard to forget. If this story moved you, tap like to support thoughtful storytelling. Subscribe for more real moments of courage and character. And tell us in the comments, have you ever refused something that cost you comfort but saved your self-respect?